on in now, my friend. Find yourself a seat by that window. The one with the glass, just a little fogged around the edges. Feel the sway of the carriage under you, gentle as an old lullaby. Hear the low murmur of the wheels on the track sliding us through the dark like a whisper. This is a long night story, one you don't rush. You let it curl around you slow, like steam from a cup of tea on a cold evening. Tonight we're riding back through time to follow the life of a boy who grew into a storm, and then into something even deeper than that. A man who changed his name, his mind, his heart, and his whole direction more than once. A man the world learned to call MalcolmX. But before he was MalcolmX, before the speeches and the headlines and the danger, he was just a tiny baby in a cold little house under an enormous sky. The year was 1925, winter in Omaha, Nebraska. The kind of winter where the wind feels like it's got teeth, biting through cracks in the walls, rattling loose shutters in the night. Snow lay over the fields in thick sheets, as if somebody had pulled a white blanket over the land and told it to hush. In a small wooden house, in that quiet whiteness, a woman labored, jaw tight, hands gripping the bedsheets. Her name was Louise. In the next room, a man paced the floorboards, Bible open in his big hands, lips moving in silent prayer. That was Earl, her husband, preacher, organizer, troublemaker in the eyes of people who didn't like to see black folk stand tall. Outside, somewhere far off in the dark, a train horn called out once, long and lonely. And then, inside that little house, a child's first cry cut through the cold. Malcolm Little. That's what they wrote down. Simple, neat letters on a birth certificate that didn't say a word about the storm of history wrapped around that tiny body. Didn't mention the hate already watching that house. Didn't mention the hope those parents had. Hope big enough to reach all the way back to Africa and forward into a future none of them would live to see. For a little while, that house was warm. Louise cooking in the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient, turning scraps into meals that smelled like Love Earl coming and going with his Bible and his Garveyite papers, talking to neighbors about black pride, about going back to Africa, about not waiting for white approval to live free. The babies came, one after another, the house filling with little feet and little voices. The littles were noisy, alive, stubbornly joyful. But even in those first years, danger stood outside like frost on the windows. Earl's voice, that big, booming preacher voice, didn't sit right with the kinds of white men who liked their black folks quiet. He spoke on street corners about Marcus Garvey and self-reliance. He told black families they were beautiful, intelligent, worthy. He said they should stop begging for space in a world that treated them like shadows and start building their own. That kind of talk brings a certain kind of visitor. Some nights, the children would be in bed, half asleep, when horses' hooves would crunch on the frozen road outside. Men riding with sheets over their heads, eyes sharp through little cutout holes. Sometimes they'd circle the house. Sometimes they'd shout. Sometimes they'd just sit and stare at the windows. "Stay down," Louise would whisper, pulling the curtains tight, her heart pounding hard enough that little Malcolm could feel it when he pressed his cheek to her chest. "Don't move. Don't say a word." The clan, the night riders, whatever name you give them, they were all part of the same sickness. One night, they came harder, hooves louder, voices rougher, threats sharper. They banged on the door, shouting for Earl, telling him to get out of town, telling him they knew what he'd been saying. Malcolm was too young to understand the words. but he understood the fear. There's a kind of silence that falls over a house when everyone inside knows one wrong move could be the last he'd remember that feeling for the rest of his life. The way hate could press against a door like a storm. Earl didn't bow. No, sir. He moved his family instead, packed them up and carried them north to Michigan, to Lansing first, then the outskirts. Anything to get farther from the men on horseback and the cold smiles of people who thought they owned the land and everyone on it. Hope is a stubborn passenger. It followed them to Michigan and took a seat in the corner of their new home. Earl found work, preached when he could, organized when he had strength. Louise did what black mothers have always done. Stretched every dollar, every scrap of food, every ounce of patience until it covered more than it ever should have. For a while, little Malcolm knew simple joys, running through fields with his siblings, listening to his father's booming voice on Sunday, smelling his mother's bread baking, warm and real in a world that often felt cold and unreal. But Michigan had its own brand of hate. There were signs, Negroes not wanted after dark, and whispers about certain neighborhoods where black families weren't supposed to buy. When Earl tried to move his family into a better house, white neighbors and officials pushed back, told him the deed didn't apply to people like him. A Negro problem, they called it, as if his existence were some kind of paperwork error. Still, Earl pushed. Still, he preached. Still, he told his children they were somebody. Then came the night the track swallowed him. He left the house like any other evening, coat pulled tight, hat low against the wind, a Bible under his arm. The younger ones watched him go, Malcolm, 6 years old, saw his father's back disappear into the dusk, and never saw it come back. They found him near the streetcar line, body broken, head crushed. The official word was accident. The insurance company called it suicide at one point, just to worm their way out of paying the policy. But the black folks in Lansing, they knew. They'd heard the threats. They'd seen the faces of local racists twisted with hate when Earl spoke. They knew what happens to black men who refuse to bow. For a child, though, you don't pass legal categories. Your father was here, and now he isn't. The world had one pillar, and now it's gone. The grief wrapped itself around that house like smoke that wouldn't clear. Louise tried to keep everything standing. She took in work, stretched food until the pots were almost empty, refused charity when it came with insults attached. She scolded the children when they were careless, praised them when they did well, insisted they speak proper English, know their worth. But grief that heavy is like carrying stones in your pockets everywhere you go. After a while, it starts to pull you under. The welfare agencies didn't help. They didn't see a strong woman fighting to keep her family intact. They saw a black woman they could bully, second guess, shuffle through offices, undermine. They questioned her groceries, her discipline, her sanity. They kept coming into her home, looking around like inspectors, counting plates, judging every decision. And all the while, the children were watching, Malcolm included. He saw his mother's proud back slowly bend under weight no one was offering to share. He saw the light in her eyes flicker and then dim. He saw her talking to herself more, crying behind doors, struggling with bills that wouldn't stretch. By the time he was 12, the state made its move. They came in with papers and solemn faces, talking about the best interest of the children, as if the children's best interest was to be scattered like seeds on dry ground. They took Louise away, put her in a psychiatric hospital. The word breakdown was used, as if a person can be expected to remain unbroken after everything she'd carried. The children were split apart into foster homes, some together, some alone, all disoriented. That's how Malcolm learned what it feels like to belong nowhere. He slept in bedrooms that smelled of unfamiliar soap, ate at tables where other children seemed to know all the inside jokes, lived in houses where he was cared for, sometimes, but never truly rooted. In school, though, he shined. He was quick with words, sharp with numbers, hungry to learn. Teachers praised him. Classmates looked to him for answers, it seemed, for a moment, like the tracks of his life might lead to something bright. One day, a teacher asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. Malcolm, serious and hopeful, said he wanted to be a lawyer. A simple sentence. A young boy naming his dream. The teacher leaned back, shook his head, smiled that thin, terrible smile people get when they're about to crush something delicate and think they're doing you a favor. Be realistic, he said. Law is no kind of job for a Negro. You'd make a good carpenter, though. Just like that, in one small classroom in one small town, the world tried to shrink him down to fit inside its narrow box. Now maybe if you added up everything that had happened before, the death of his father, the loss of his mother, the split of his siblings, the cold stare of white folks in town, that one comment shouldn't have been the breaking point. But humans ain't simple math. Sometimes one small cruelty lands on top of a mountain of old hurt and sends the whole thing sliding. He smiled on the outside, maybe. Nodded. Kept his voice polite. But inside, something twisted. He saw clearly, maybe for the first time, that no matter how hard he tried to play their game, the rules were stacked. The finish line they offered him was never the one he wanted. So he stepped off that track, left the small town school with its narrow dreams, left the quiet streets that had watched his family be broken apart, followed a different call, one that sounded like city noise and possibility. Boston. The name itself felt like a door opening. He went to live with his half-sister, Ella. Now, Ella was her own kind of force, tall, confident, strolling through the world like she knew exactly where she belonged and dared anyone to question it. She had a job, a home, a presence. She didn't bow her head in the street. She didn't soften her voice for white comfort. For a boy who'd watched his whole world bend and crumble, Ella was proof that it was still possible to stand upright. Boston dazzled him. Brick buildings stretching toward a gray New England sky. Streetcars clanging, traffic humming. People from so many different backgrounds rushing past each other in a blur. In the black neighborhoods, Roxbury and such, the nights were alive. Music spilling from doorways. Arguments on corners about baseball, politics, and God lines outside dance halls. Barbershops where men debated loudly, cutting hair and cutting through lies at the same time. Malcolm started at the bottom, shining shoes at the train station, hustling tips with that quick wit of his. He watched how men in suits walked, how women laughed, how the city moved. He absorbed it all. He took jobs as a sandwich maker on trains, working routes that carried him up and down the East Coast. On those trains, he saw glimpses of worlds richer than anything his foster homes had shown him. Fancy passengers with fine clothes and expensive perfume. Porters and waiters who kept everything moving, often invisible to the very people they were serving. The iron rails carried him to New York for the first time, and New York whispered a name in his ear. Harlem. Harlem in the 1940s was a universe all its own. The air throbbed with jazz. Tenements stacked people on top of people, but somehow the streets never felt empty. There were preachers on corners, hustlers in alleys, poets in tiny apartments, and singers pouring their hearts into microphones in dimly lit clubs. Once Malcolm tasted Harlem, Boston started to feel small. He drifted there more and more, spending time in pool halls, watching the dice games, learning the unspoken rules of the street. He changed the way he dressed, the way he talked, the way he carried himself. The hurt child from Lansing was still inside him, but he covered that boy with silk shirts, sharp shoes, and a conked hairstyle that burned his scalp, but made his reflection look like the men he admired. They started calling him Detroit Red. Detroit for the place he'd spent some time in. Red for that reddish tint in his hair. Detroit Red could work a room. He could tell a joke, run a number, spot a mark. He hustled, gambled, danced, chased thrills with a hunger that came from more than just wanting fun. It came from trying to bury the feeling of being unwanted, underestimated, unrooted. But every fast life has an invisible clock ticking somewhere in the background. He started doing more than shine shoes and make sandwiches, started running numbers, getting involved in petty theft, then not so petty theft. He thought he could outsmart the law the way he'd out-talked teachers and sweet-talked gatekeepers. He thought the streets were a game where a clever mind could always stay 3 moves ahead. The law thought otherwise. When he was 21, the game ended with handcuffs and a judge who looked at him like he was just another file to clear. Burglary. Caught with stolen goods. The sentence came down heavy. Heavier than what white defendants were getting for the same crime. That's how it went, and still goes too often. The courthouse swallowed him. The prison spat him out into its gray belly. The bars closed. The echo of that steel-on-steel sound followed him into his cell. Detroit Red died a quiet death in that moment, even though nobody knew it yet. Not even him. Prison stripped away the neon, the music, the noise. No more clubs, no more zoot suits, no more fast talking. Just walls, routines, and the long, unbroken stretch of time. At first, he fought it. Loud, angry, bristling at guards, arguing with chaplains, pacing like a caged animal. They started calling him Satan on the inside because of the way he cursed religion, cursed the world, cursed himself. Rage kept him warm for a while. But rage burns fuel, and there's only so much you can carry before the tank runs dry. In the quiet that followed, letters arrived. From his brothers, from his sisters, from people out in the world he'd half forgotten he was connected to. They told him about a man named Elijah Muhammad. Told him about the Nation of Islam. Told him that the white man was the devil, and that black men and women needed to cleanse themselves of his poison, stand apart, rebuild themselves. They told him he didn't know his own name. That Little was the name of a slave master, not a free man. Those letters lit a new kind of fire in him, not the wild fire of Harlem nights, but the steady burn of awakening. Still, it wasn't faith at first. It was challenge. He started reading to prove people wrong, then kept reading because the words started rearranging his whole understanding of the world. He read history and found entire chapters missing from the lessons he'd been given in school. Learned about empires in Africa before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the ocean. Learned about resistance, about rebellions, about black thinkers and leaders and revolutionaries who'd been erased from the story. He copied whole pages of the dictionary by hand, line after line, just to master the language that had once been used to belittle him. He devoured philosophy, religion, politics, economics. Any book that passed through that prison library had a chance of passing through his hands. Other prisoners noticed the change. The loud-mouthed Satan quieted. His walk steadied. His eyes sharpened with a different kind of intensity. Even some guards began to treat him with wary respect, sensing there was more going on behind those eyes than mere defiance. In that small cell, Malcolm began the slow work of rebirth. By the time he formally accepted the teachings of the Nation of Islam, the ground had already been tilled. He was ready for a new identity, a new purpose, a new name. He let little go, took the letter X instead, not as an end point, but as a marker. X for the unknown African name stolen by slavery. X for all the ancestors whose full selves had been erased. MalcolmX. The name fit like a blade in a well-made sheath. The boy who'd watched his father die, the teenager who'd been bounced through foster homes, the hustler who'd danced in Harlem, all of them were still part of him. But now they were chapters, not cages. When the prison gates finally opened and he stepped back onto the outside world's concrete, the air must have tasted different. The sky looked the same, grey and wide, but the man standing under it was not the same one who'd walked into that cell. He didn't head back to Harlem's nightclubs, didn't put on the conch and zoot suit. He headed to temple, to a community, to a mission. He walked into the Nation of Islam as a student and quickly became something more. The first time he stood in front of a room full of black men and women, all of them carrying their own heavy loads of humiliation and hurt, and spoke, really spoke. It must have felt like everything that had ever happened to him had been a rehearsal for that moment. He told them they were not what the world said they were. Not lazy, not ugly, not destined for poverty or prison. He told them they were divine creations, members of a nation older and nobler than any slave ship or plantation could ever crush. He spoke in sentences that were clean and sharp, cutting through confusion like a knife through cloth. No stuttering, no hedging, no softening of truths to make anyone comfortable. Crowds grew, temples multiplied, newspapers took notice. Reporters who expected to find a raving radical instead found a disciplined man in a neat suit, speaking calmly, logically, with a memory full of facts and a voice full of conviction. The FBI took notice too, clipped his quotes, filed his photos, opened thick folders with his name on them. They saw what he was doing, waking people up, and marked him as dangerous. But that's later on the track. Right now, in this stretch of our journey, Malcolm is rising out of poverty, out of ignorance, out of the shadows of other people's definitions. Each speech he gives is another step on a staircase he can't quite see the top of yet, but he knows it's leading somewhere important. And this old train keeps rolling through the night, choo-choo, as we follow him. Now picture Malcolm in the mid-1950s, tall, neatly dressed, polished shoes, crisp suit, dark tie, and a face that held both intensity and restraint. A man stepping into purpose like a well-fitted coat. Everywhere he went, heads turned. Not because he demanded the attention, but because he carried himself like a man who understood his own weight. He talked to crowds as if he'd been talking to crowds for lifetimes. His words weren't shouted, they were etched, carved into the air with the kind of clarity that made even the most distracted listeners sit up straighter. He'd stand at a podium in some rented hall or inside a growing mosque, hands steady on the wood, eyes alert and unblinking. And he'd say things people had never heard spoken aloud, at least not with that confidence, not with that fire, not with that refusal to bend. Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose? Who taught you to hate the shape of your lips? Those questions were lightning bolts. They struck the dark sky of Black America's consciousness, splitting it open, lighting long hidden places that had been bleeding quietly for generations. You could feel rooms shift when he spoke. People who'd spent their whole lives shrinking suddenly felt themselves expanding inside. People who'd been told they were problems started realizing the problem wasn't them. It was the world built around them. The Nation of Islam grew like an uncut vine. Temples opened in Detroit, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, LA. Young men who'd been hustlers just like Malcolm's straightened their backs, polished their shoes, walked with discipline. Women found community, safety, purpose. Children saw adults around them with confidence they'd rarely witnessed. And Elijah Muhammad, the leader, the old man with the soft voice and stern eyes, saw Malcolm as a gift, a bright sword, a young lion. He praised Malcolm in letters, lifted him up in sermons, leaned on him as temples blossomed across the country. Malcolm adored him, trusted him, looked at him the way a son looks at the father he always wished he'd had. But power has shadows. Always. And as Malcolm grew, as temples grew, as crowds grew, resentment sprouted like weeds beneath the surface. Older ministers who'd once had the spotlight now watched it shift onto Malcolm. Men who felt they deserved more saw Malcolm eclipsing them with speed and brilliance. Others feared he was becoming bigger than the nation itself. But for Malcolm, none of that mattered. At least not yet. He was too busy working, up before the sun, writing sermons, teaching classes, organizing events, meeting people across the country, debating reporters, lecturing college groups, visiting prisons to uplift men who reminded him of his own past. He was a man fueled by mission. And when he married Betty, that gave him balance he didn't know he needed. Betty Shabazz was gentle but strong, soft-spoken but grounded. She steadied Malcolm like a hand on a restless shoulder. They built a home full of warmth, simple, modest, peaceful when the outside world wasn't. Daughters came, beautiful, bright, curious, and Malcolm loved them with a tenderness that would have surprised those who only saw the fierce public version of him. Late at night, after speeches, he'd sit quietly at the kitchen table, sipping tea, the light low. Betty humming softly in another room, children asleep. He'd think, reflect, study, prepare. He lived with discipline because he knew what undisciplined life had once done to him. He prayed at dawn, worked through the day, prayed again and again. He restricted his diet, his entertainment, his vices, his tongue, everything sharpened to serve his mission. But the world around him, that world was changing. Civil rights protests spread across the South like brush fires. Sit-ins, marches, brutal police beatings broadcast on national TV. Malcolm watched it all with a mixture of pain and frustration. He respected the bravery of those young men and women sitting at lunch counters while mobs screamed in their faces. He respected the discipline of the marchers in Birmingham and Selma, but he didn't agree with the idea of non-violence as a permanent philosophy. He'd say, if a man puts his hands on you, send him to the cemetery. Not as a threat, as a statement of self-respect. Reporters loved quoting him. They painted him as the angry counterpoint to Dr. King, the fire to King's water. But the truth was more complicated. Malcolm respected King, respected the movement. He just believed they were fighting the same beast with different weapons. The The media didn't want nuance, though. They wanted headlines, and Malcolm X was a headline machine. With every interview, his visibility grew. With every speech, his influence deepened. With every newspaper article, his name reached farther. And with that growth came more enemies. The FBI placed more informants in the Nation of Islam, kept thicker files, followed Malcolm's car, listened to his calls, shadowed his steps. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting for a mistake, waiting for a fracture, waiting for the right moment. And inside the nation, the fracture was forming. Whispers first, little comments, small slights, meetings he wasn't invited to, letters he wasn't shown. Malcolm didn't notice at first. He took every slight as a misunderstanding, every shift in tone as exhaustion, every moment of distance as something temporary. Because Malcolm didn't expect betrayal from his own people, not after everything they'd built together, not after Elijah Muhammad had been a father figure to him. But truth doesn't ask permission to reveal itself. It just arrives. And it arrived in the form of a rumor, a whisper carried through the grapevine. Women inside the nation, young secretaries, teenagers who looked up to Elijah Muhammad pregnant, frightened, conflicted. At first, Malcolm refused to believe it. The man he'd devoted his life to? The man who'd preached strict morality? The man who'd lifted Malcolm from prison to purpose? No, impossible. He pushed it aside. He defended Elijah. He silenced questions until the truth wouldn't stay buried. One day, Malcolm walked into a room with Elijah Muhammad. He asked him directly, expected denial, expected guidance, expected the man he loved as a father to stand clean and whole. But Elijah didn't deny it, didn't apologize, didn't show shame. He explained it away, said prophets before him had done the same, said it was allowed. Something cracked inside Malcolm that day. Not anger, not rage, not betrayal, not at first. Just disappointment. Deep. Bone deep. The kind of disappointment that makes a man question everything he ever knew. But he didn't leave. Not yet. He stayed. Served. Spoke. Tried to reconcile truth with reverence. But cracks don't mend simply because we wish them to. Opportunity for manipulation crawled in through those cracks. Men jealous of Malcolm filled Elijah's ear. Men threatened by Malcolm whispered about ambition. Men who wanted Malcolm out saw their chance. And then came November 1963. President John F. Kennedy was shot. The world froze. Televisions flickered with grief. Americans wept openly. Malcolm was asked to comment. He said, "Chickens coming home to roost." Not to celebrate the death, but to point out the violence America had bred for generations. The media twisted it, tangled it, turned it into scandal, and the Nation of Islam seized the moment. Elijah Muhammad suspended Malcolm for 90 days, silenced him, publicly distanced himself. Malcolm took the suspension quietly, on the outside. But on the inside, the last thread in the rope snapped. When the 90 days ended, Malcolm didn't return. He stepped away, stepped into the world alone, stepped into uncertainty, danger, reinvention. A second rebirth. He'd already transformed once in prison, from Detroit Red to Malcolm X. Now he was shedding another skin, leaving behind the movement that had shaped him, leaving behind a father figure, leaving behind the safety of community. He was becoming something larger, a man not bound by doctrine, not boxed by one ideology, not contained by one version of himself. The next part of the story, that's the part where he becomes global, where he becomes dangerous to the powers that be, where he becomes more open, more reflective, more human than ever before. And this train, Choo, is gliding right toward that turning point. When Malcolm stepped away from the Nation of Islam in early 1964, he didn't step into silence. He stepped into wind. Wind that carried the sound of global struggle. Wind that carried questions he'd never asked himself before. Wind that whispered, "Keep walking." For the first time since leaving prison, Malcolm was spiritually homeless. No movement behind him, no leader above him, no choir to echo his words. Just his own voice, his own mind, his own restless hunger for truth. But some men are built for that kind of solitude. Some men bloom in the spaces where certainty breaks apart. And Malcolm, he was one of those rare souls who found clarity in the unknown. The first thing he did was pray. He prayed not like a man repeating memorized lines, but like a man knocking on a door in the dark, asking for new light. Then he formed the Muslim mosque, Inca, a place for worship, yes, but also a place for reflection, a space where he could rebuild his understanding of Islam from the ground up, free from the distortions he now saw in the nation's teachings. He started reading more widely, talking to scholars he once ignored, meeting Muslims from backgrounds he'd never known existed, Africans, Arabs, Europeans, Asians. And as he listened to their voices, something inside him shifted. He realized he'd been shown only one narrow interpretation of the faith. Realized the world was far bigger, spiritually, culturally, geographically, than he'd ever been allowed to imagine. Then came the invitation, a chance to travel abroad, to see Islam in its living, breathing, global form, to stand in the holiest places and test the truths he'd carried for so long. He didn't hesitate. He boarded a plane, the same man who once rode trains as a busboy, shining shoes for tips, now flying across continents, his mind open like never before. And when he arrived in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the world cracked open. Arab hosts welcomed him with warmth. Men whose skin was pale shook his hand without hesitation. Men with blue eyes called him brother. Men who'd never been touched by America's racial madness embraced him like kin. A lifetime of pain, prejudice, exclusion, humiliation didn't vanish instantly. But something loosened inside him. Something long coiled began to unwind. He traveled to Mecca for the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage millions make every year. And oh, my friend, that moment was a sunrise in the deep night of Malcolm's soul. Picture him there, dressed in simple white cloth, just like every other pilgrim. No ranks, no race, no status, no past. Just a man among men, equal before God. He walked among thousands from every corner of the earth, African farmers, Indonesian fishermen, Turkish scholars, Persian tradesmen, a river of humanity moving together toward the same holy place. He prayed beside blonde-haired men, ate with men who, in America, would have been called white, shared water with men who'd never heard the word racism in their own language. He wrote home saying, "What I have seen here has forced me to rearrange much of my previous thinking." That was Malcolm's gift. Not only his fire, not only his logic, not only his courage, but his willingness to grow. A lesser man would have clung to old beliefs because they felt safe. A lesser man would have let pride trap him in old ideas. But Malcolm, he let truth change him. He saw that the world wasn't divided the way he once believed. He saw that prejudice wasn't a human constant. It was a sickness of certain societies, certain histories, certain systems. He saw that unity was possible. Real unity. Not the kind that requires erasing identity, but the kind that honors it. And the Malcolm who emerged from Mecca, that man shined like a polished lantern. He came back to America with a new layer of calm, not softness, but clarity. A clarity sharpened by global perspective. He still condemned racism, fiercer than ever in fact, but now he separated the sickness from the skin. He spoke about humans instead of categories. He saw allies where he once saw only enemies. He reached out to Dr. King's movement, saying their differences had been exaggerated by forces eager to keep black leaders divided. He met with African diplomats, building global networks. He traveled across Africa and the Middle East, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, speaking with presidents, journalists, freedom fighters, students. And everywhere he went, he was welcomed, not as a radical, not as an outcast, but as a leader, a thinker, a man with insight forged from the hardest fires. People listened because Malcolm spoke with lived truth. Not theory, not wishful thinking. Truth carved from heartbreak and loss and revelation. He returned to America with a new organization in his heart. The Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU. Its mission was bigger than integration or separation. It was human rights, global justice, international solidarity. He planned to bring America before the United Nations, to expose the country's treatment of black citizens as a violation of human dignity on the world stage. That idea alone terrified the government, because domestic issues become global issues when someone with Malcolm's voice carries them beyond America's borders. And the government wasn't the only one alarmed. Inside the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's transformation raised old resentments back to life. Leaders who once dismissed him now feared him. Some saw him as a threat to their authority, others as a traitor who had walked away from the one man they considered infallible. And so the shadows around him deepened. His phone clicked with surveillance. Cars trailed him. Strangers lurked near his windows at night. His home in Queens was firebombed while his daughters slept. The house filled with smoke and heat. Betty screamed for the children. Malcolm burst through the hallways, grabbing babies, throwing blankets over burning doorways. They escaped barefoot into the cold winter night, watching flames chew through the walls of the house they'd built. Malcolm stood in the snow, breath shaking, children clinging to his legs, and even then, he refused to bow. "If I can die having brought any light," he said, "then all the credit is due to God. Only the mistakes are mine." He kept speaking, kept traveling, kept warning that his days might be numbered. He said, "I do not expect to live long enough to read this book." He said, "They will probably kill me for what I'm saying." He said, "I only pray that I will be able to die for the truth." But he didn't stop, because some men don't run from danger when truth calls them forward. Some men keep walking, and Malcolm, he walked with purpose, even when the shadows grew teeth. The final weeks of his life were filled with restless movement, meetings, speeches, plans, travel, letters, late-night reflections, a sense that time had condensed into something sharp and urgent. He slept little, thought deeply, held his daughters with longer embraces, as if memorizing the shape of their small bodies in his arms. Yet every morning, he rose with renewed clarity. He had shed every identity that no longer fit him, like a snake shedding old skin. Detroit Red was gone. The nation minister was gone. Even the fiery provocateur was mellowing into a thoughtful strategist with global vision. What remained was the truest version of him, Malcolm the human being, Malcolm the seeker, Malcolm the teacher, Malcolm the man who'd walked through the furnace and come out with eyes that saw farther than anyone expected. And the world, oh, the world felt the weight of him in those final days. It's like the air around him knew. Even the children felt it. They later said their father was quieter, gentler, more reflective. Betty felt it. She said he seemed burdened by a sense of inevitability, but none of it stopped him. He was a train on its final stretch of track, steam thick in the air, whistle low and mournful, heading toward a moment the universe had carved for him, long before he took his first breath in that little winter house in Omaha. The winter of 1965 settled over New York like a cold hand. The city moved on the surface, taxis honking, steam rising from manholes, crowds hurrying past shop windows. But underneath it all, there was a tension you could feel in your teeth. Malcolm felt it too. Danger clung to him like a second coat. He could sense it in the street corners, in the eyes of strangers, in the way every knock at the door made Betty look up a little too quickly. But he didn't run, didn't hide, didn't soften his message. If anything, he sharpened it. Every speech that winter felt like a man etching his final truths into the stone of time. Not dramatic, not panicked, just certain. He told crowds, "I only want to tell the truth. Whether I live or die is in God's hands." And the crowds, Lord, they hung on his every word, not because he yelled, but because he spoke with the calm of a man who had seen his destiny in a mirror and accepted it. His final interviews glowed with that eerie clarity. He spoke often about unity, more than he ever had before. He said the black struggle wasn't just American, it was global. He said oppression looked different in Ghana than it did in Harlem, but the root was the same. He spoke about humility, about breaking old beliefs to make room for truth, about loving one's people without learning to hate others. He didn't sound like a man preparing for war. He sounded like a man preparing to leave wisdom behind. Even his enemies could feel it. Reporters who once tried to corner him now listened with uncomfortable respect. Professors who dismissed him now quoted him quietly among colleagues. College students followed him from town to town like pilgrims, scribbling notes, whispering that they'd never heard anyone speak with such honesty. But shadows don't like honesty. And the shadows around Malcolm had started to sharpen into shapes. Threats came almost daily. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Anonymous letters. Cars parked too long outside his home. Faces memorized in the crowd, then seen again in a different city. The Nation of Islam denounced him. Tabloids mocked him. Government agencies watched him more closely than ever. Even friends told him to be careful. He listened, but he didn't bend. He told one interviewer, "Every morning I wake up, I know I am living on borrowed time. But if the price of telling the truth is death, I will gladly pay it." He continued to work tirelessly. Every day was filled with meetings, letters, phone calls, strategy sessions, community visits, youth outreach, fundraising, study, prayer, travel. He slept little, ate irregularly, thought constantly. Betty worried. She saw the lines deepening around his eyes, the weight settling in his shoulders, saw him pace the floor late at night, whispering prayers, saw him check the locks more often, hold his daughters a little tighter. She begged him to take a break. But Malcolm smiled, tired, sad, tender, and said, "I can't stop now. There's too much to be done." His last major speech before the end was electric. He spoke at the Harlem Freedom Rally. Thousands came. He looked like a man carved from purpose, lean, intense, alive with conviction. He said, "You can't separate peace from freedom. No one can be at peace unless he has his freedom." And the crowd roared. They didn't know they were witnessing one of his last great moments. He didn't know either. But somewhere deep inside him, maybe he felt something shifting. Then came February 20th, the night before the assassination. It was cold, quiet, the kind of night where the city's noises feel muffled, like they're wrapped in cotton. Malcolm was restless. He paced his living room while Betty brewed tea. They spoke softly about the children, about security concerns, about the next day's event at the Audubon Ballroom. Betty suggested they cancel. Malcolm shook his head. "I must speak. People are expecting me." His daughters peeked from the hallway, watching their father pace like a man trying to outrun a thought he couldn't shake. Later that night, Malcolm tucked them into bed, kissed their foreheads, smoothed their blankets with slow, gentle hands. One daughter asked, "Daddy, are you going to die?" Malcolm paused, breath caught, heart pounding, then forced a smile. "Not tonight." But after he walked out of the room, the smile fell. He stood in the dark kitchen, hands pressed against the counter, eyes closed. He knew. Everything in him knew. But when dawn crept over New York on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm rose like it was any other day. He showered, dressed in a dark suit, knotted his tie carefully, held Betty close for a moment longer than usual. Then he left for the Audubon Ballroom. The ballroom felt uneasy from the start. There were strange faces, police absent when they were usually present, men sitting stiffly in corners, tension crawling along the walls. Malcolm sensed it. He whispered to his security team, "Stay sharp." He stepped onto the stage just after 3 p.m. The crowd applauded. Families, students, elders, activists, mothers with children. He greeted them warmly. "Assalamu alaikum." The people responded, "Wa alaikum salam." Then Malcolm said the last full sentence of his life. "Please make yourselves comfortable." Silence. A man rose in the audience, shouted something. A commotion broke out. And in that split second, the shadows Malcolm had felt for months finally took form. Gunfire cracked through the ballroom. Sharp, sudden, merciless. People screamed. Chairs crashed. Smoke filled the air. Malcolm stepped forward, instinctively, protectively, and bullets tore through him. He fell beside the podium. Betty ran toward him, screaming his name. Men tried to tend to him. Blood pooled across the stage boards. His last sight was the chaos of a crowd he had come to teach. His last sound was the frantic cry of the woman who loved him. His last breath was taken in service of truth. He was 39, younger than many men who spend their lives never finding purpose. And yet Malcolm lived enough for several lifetimes. When the doctors announced his death, a strange stillness settled over Harlem. Not silence, Stillness, like the city was holding its breath. And just like that, the lantern that had burned so fiercely was gone. But the light didn't die. Not even close. When word of Malcolm's death spread, New York seemed to exhale in disbelief. People froze mid-step on sidewalks. Newspapers rushed out extras. Radios interrupted jazz shows and weather reports with the announcement, Malcolm X has been assassinated. In Harlem, mothers wept openly in the street. Old men sat down on stoops, staring at their hands. Young boys who once mocked his seriousness fell silent, and girls who barely understood politics felt their chests tighten with a sadness they couldn't name. It was as if a storm had cracked open above the city. A storm without rain, without thunder, just grief. The next hours were chaos. Reporters crowded the hospital. Cameras flashed. Confusion swirled through the corridors. But inside one small room, stillness. Betty Shabazz stood alone beside her husband's body. 39 bullet wounds. 39 tears in the flesh of the man she loved. 39 echoes that would ring through her life forever. She brushed his cheek with trembling fingers, straightened his collar even though it no longer mattered, whispered a prayer only God and her heart would ever hear. Betty had always been strong, but that night, strength felt like a cruel demand. The world responded in waves. Black communities mourned deeply. Some marched, some prayed, some shouted, some simply sat in their homes, staring at a blank wall, unable to speak. White America, confused, guilty, shocked, looked back at the man it had misunderstood for so long and finally saw something closer to truth. Civil rights leaders who once disagreed with him now spoke with softened voices. Dr. King said, "While we did not always see eye to eye, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and a deep respect for his courage and sincerity." Foreign governments sent condolences. African leaders declared him a martyr. Arab nations sent telegrams honoring him. And Malcolm's name, the same name newspapers once smeared, was suddenly spoken with reverence, because death has a way of stripping away the noise. It leaves only the truth standing. The funeral. Ah, friend. That day was heavy as iron. Harlem's streets overflowed. So many people gathered that police had to block off whole avenues. Some stood on rooftops. Some climbed lampposts. Some squeezed shoulder to shoulder in doorways just to catch a glimpse of the procession. Inside the Faith Temple Church of God in Christ, mourners packed every seat. The air smelled of flowers, lilies, roses, carnations bought with small bills from people who didn't have much, but gave anyway. Betty sat in the front row, her daughters beside her, little hands gripping fabrics they didn't understand, little eyes searching for a father who wasn't coming home. The coffin was simple, mahogany, polished. Malcolm's body dressed in a dark suit, his glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. Peaceful. Not because death is peaceful, but because truth can give even tragedy a certain grace. Ossie Davis delivered the eulogy, his voice deep, trembling, resolute. He called Malcolm a prince, a black man who loved his people fiercely, a man America misunderstood because it feared him. Davis said, "We will know him for what he was and is, a prince, our own black, shining prince." Thick silence followed those words, a silence filled with love, pain, pride, and a resolve that would echo for generations. After the funeral, Malcolm's body was taken to Ferncliff Cemetery. The procession moved slowly. Children walked beside the hearse. Old women murmured prayers. Young men clenched their fists, not in violence, but in grief too deep for open hands. As the coffin was lowered, someone began to sing softly, an old spiritual, cracked with emotion. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. And as the notes drifted over the winter air, Betty placed her hand on the coffin. She didn't cry. Her tears had dried hours ago. What remained in her eyes was strength, the kind that rises from the bones of someone forced to stand when the world tries to fold them. But Malcolm's death wasn't an ending. It was a detonation of consciousness, of courage, of curiosity, of identity. People who had once feared him now read every word he had ever written. College students formed underground reading groups for his speeches. Young men in barbershops debated his ideas. Women in living rooms discussed his views on dignity and respect. Prisoners devoured his autobiography like scripture. That book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, published months after his death, hit readers like a fist made of truth and humanity. Even today, decades later, people say, "That book changed me." And it's true. It's changed millions. Malcolm's daughters grew up carrying his fire. Atala, Kubila, Ilyasa, Gamila, Malika, Malak. Each one bore the weight of a father taken too soon, and each one carved her own path into the world. Some became educators, some activists, some authors, some leaders, and every single one of them carried the strength of their parents, Betty's resilience, Malcolm's clarity. Betty Shabazz became a force in her own right. She earned her doctorate, became a professor, spoke about family, struggle, and education, raised her daughters with grace sharper than steel. She rarely spoke of vengeance, rarely spoke of bitterness. Instead, she carried dignity like a shield. She said, "The real power is in lifting others, not in tearing them down." That was her way of continuing Malcolm's work, through compassion sharpened by discipline. Meanwhile, the world began to reinterpret Malcolm's life. Scholars rewrote chapters of history. Artists painted murals of him across Harlem, Detroit, Chicago. Musicians sampled his speeches. Activists quoted him in rallies. African leaders invoked his name in independence movements. Suddenly, Malcolm wasn't just a Black American figure. He was global. In South Africa, anti-apartheid organizers studied his teachings. In Palestine, youth found strength in his words about oppression. In the Caribbean, entire neighborhoods claimed him as one of their own. He became a symbol larger than his body ever was, a symbol of evolution, of honesty, of transformation. And that's the part people always misunderstand. Malcolm wasn't great because he was angry. Malcolm wasn't great because he was militant. Malcolm wasn't great because he was fiery. He was great because he grew. Again and again and again. He outgrew the pain of childhood, outgrew the streets of Harlem, outgrew the walls of prison, outgrew the rigid thinking of the Nation of Islam, outgrew the narrow lens of American race politics, outgrew even his own past. He kept evolving until his last breath. That's why people follow him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human in motion. A man unafraid to shed old skins. A man unafraid to say, "I was wrong, I've learned, I will grow." There's courage in that. More courage than most people ever find. As years turned into decades, Malcolm's legacy didn't fade. It expanded. In the 70s, activists marched with his image. In the 80s, hip-hop revived his fire. In the 90s, Spike Lee's film Malcolm X reignited global fascination. In the 2000s, classrooms across the world studied him. In the 2010s and beyond, new movements drew straight from his teachings. And today, you can feel Malcolm's presence anywhere people fight for dignity, anywhere someone stands up against injustice, anywhere a young soul searches for identity, anywhere truth is spoken at a cost. Legacy, my friend, is a train that never stops. And Malcolm built his with rails strong enough to hold the weight of generations. The conductor sees it like this. Some folks leave footprints, some leave shadows, some leave whispers, some leave scars. But Malcolm, he left a route. A path through the dark, a map drawn from pain and learning and faith and fire, a way forward. All right now, friend. Settle in. The rails are getting softer beneath us. That slow, steady rhythm that feels like a heartbeat, old as the world itself. Chew. Chew. This is the last stretch of the journey, where the conductor sets his hand on your shoulder, where the night goes still, and where Malcolm's life folds itself into something larger than time, larger than memory, larger than even the man who lived it. Let the lantern glow warm and gold. Let your breath match the sway of the train. Here comes the closing chapter. Legacy doesn't breathe, it echoes. And Malcolm's echo didn't start when he picked up a microphone, or when he walked through Harlem, or when he preached in Boston, or when he bowed his head in Mecca. It started long before, in a snow-covered house in Omaha, in the fire of Earl's sermons, in the quiet strength of Louise's spine, in the too early loss of innocence, in the grief that cracked his childhood, in the hunger that shaped his mind. Every step he took after that, every heartbreak, every choice, every transformation was part of a long, winding road that led him not just to the world, but beyond it. Today, when people speak his name, they don't speak it softly. They speak it with weight, with respect, with a kind of awe reserved for those rare souls who lived their truth all the way down to their bones. Teachers assign his autobiography not as a book, but as an experience, something to be lived, not read. Students underline lines until the ink bleeds through the page. Prisoners read his story in small, dim cells and feel something ignite in their chests. Parents tell their children, learn his name, understand his journey. Activists chant his quotes in streets lit by fire and hope. Musicians lace their lyrics with his fire. Poets draw silence from crowds by whispering the words he carried like torches. Historians revisit his speeches and admit, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes proudly, that he saw things decades before others even dared to look. Because Malcolm wasn't just a man of his time, he was a man ahead of it. When he spoke of human rights, not just civil rights, the United States wasn't ready. When he spoke of global solidarity, America wasn't listening. When he spoke of the psychology of oppression, folks called him extreme. Today, those same ideas are studied in universities as foundational truths. Time caught up to Malcolm. But by then, he was already gone, already immortal. There's something sacred about a life that refuses to stay small. And that's what Malcolm left behind. A blueprint of courage. Not the loud courage of fists and shouts. Not the romantic courage of Hollywood scripts. But the real kind. the courage to grow, to question yourself, to outgrow old beliefs, to stand against those you once followed, to strip away false identity, to walk into rooms where you're unwelcome, to say the truth even when it costs you everything. Not many men can do that. Most hold on to comfort, old stories, old tribes, old identities like lifelines. But Malcolm, he let the truth reshape him again and again. Like rivers reshape stones, like fire reshapes metal, like wind reshapes dunes. And because he grew, others grew with him. His daughters grew, his community grew, his movement grew, the world grew. The conductor's seen it with his own eyes, on long night rides across the country. A young man in Texas reading Malcolm's speeches under dim station lights. A woman in Chicago whispering his quotes to her son before school. A teenager in California sketching Malcolm's face in a notebook, eyes filled with pride. A man in Georgia telling his barber, "That book changed my whole way of thinking." A family in Detroit hanging his poster on their living room wall. A student in London reading his autobiography on a crowded train. A boy in Ghana memorizing his speeches. Malcolm's spirit travels farther than any train ever could. Now the conductor's lantern flickers, not with weakness, but with tenderness. Because this is where Malcolm's story blends into ours. See, stories like his aren't meant to stay closed in books or museums or conversations once a year on anniversaries. Stories like his are meant to ride with us, through doubt, through struggle, through the quiet moments when we're trying to figure out who we are and who we're brave enough to become. The conductor's voice slows here, soft, gentle, deep as night. He says, "You know, a man's life ain't measured by his years. It's measured by the tracks he lays down and who follows them after he's gone." Malcolm laid tracks across deserts of hatred, mountains of pain, valleys of transformation. Tracks built from courage, sharpened by loss, polished by learning. Tracks that lead toward dignity, toward truth, toward justice, toward a world where skin ain't a cage and truth ain't a luxury. Those tracks are still there, rust-proof, unbroken, waiting for the next traveler. And that, my friend, that's the real legacy. Not the speeches, not the headlines, not the myths or debates or political arguments, but the journey, the willingness to evolve, the hunger to learn, the strength to stand, the humility to grow, the fire to speak, the love to serve, the humanity to become more than what the world expected. The train slows now, lantern swaying, night breathing soft around us. And the conductor whispers, "Malcolm ain't gone. He just stepped onto another track. And if you listen real close, you can still hear his footsteps in the rails. The wheels hum beneath you. Choo, choo. Steady, warm, ancient. Rest now. Let the story settle deep in your bones. Let Malcolm's journey ride with you into sleep, not as a tragedy, but as a compass. And remember, some lives end, but some lives become light. Malcolm's did. And now that light rides with you.